I'm delighted to be invited. Can I confirm that my microphone is working? Do you hear me clearly? Yes, it's good. Okay, great.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Um, I wish I were in London with you. I miss London. Okay. Hmm?
Today it is raining.
Oh, how horrible. It's raining. Uh, okay. It's supposed to rain in London. I would like to discuss a few topics today that are related. I'm going to start with a discussion of whether the combination of computation with text as we've known it poses a danger of placing people into something of a trap, something of a loop in which we lose our future. That's topic number one. Topic number two is going to be whether text as we know it is something that we should think of as an eternal central feature of the human condition, or whether it might eventually become less important because other things come along. And that will be topic number two. And topic number three will be about, I would say, a somewhat spiritual question of whether a degree of mystification of people or text is appropriate going forward in a different way than it has been in the past because of computation. So everything good? All right. Okay, good. So let me start with topic number one. In my peculiar life, and it is really a very strange life that I can hardly believe, one of my roles is as what's called the prime scientist for one of the tech giants, which is Microsoft. And as it happens, our office is the funder and also the distribution channel for a lab called OpenAI that you might have heard of, that has created probably the highest performing so-called AI text service now, which is called GPT. There are different versions of it. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. So it's essentially what our colleagues at Stanford have started to call a foundational model, a very, very, very large scale model in which all the available text that can be gathered has been gathered and then analyzed in the context of a very, very large computational system. And the result is a service that can simulate a human interlocutor and actually perform in ways that impress people, I would say in general. For instance, it can often do reasonably well at passing high school or college level math classes, which, even though there's no representation of math inside it, as just one example, it can explain jokes. It can do all sorts of things, reasonably effective translations between languages in some cases. And yet it also has this curious property of suddenly running into very strange failures, where it's obvious that it doesn't, in fact, have any representation internally of what's being talked about. So what do we have here? The first thing to say about this type of model, oh, actually, just before I go on, may I ask, I'm very embarrassed to ask this, but how long do I have just so I can pace myself?
Hello. You're supposed to have 20 minutes.
Okay,
In total, but we have a session afterwards so we can go into a little bit. So if you can maybe 15 talking dialogue. Thank you.
All right. So what does this program actually do? Well, it really addresses the core feature of what we call text, which is sequence. Ultimately, text is a sequence of a number of things where the number of possible sequences is vastly larger than the number of original things that are sequenced. So the things that are sequenced are, well, in some languages, the letters, but in all languages, the words. And if all we do is we capture these sequences and we can statistically predict what sequences are more likely than others, we can create a simulacra of language that is remarkably effective. Now here I'll note something interesting, which is that it's all about scale, or all about the size of the model. If the model is too small, obviously it won't do anything, which is why this kind of illusion of a person inside the computer didn't really start to work until recently, because we just couldn't build big enough computers. The ones that we build to accomplish this effect are truly vast. They're the size of cities. They often are in remote places by rivers that can be used to cool them. They often have their own power sources, hopefully huge renewable non-carbon emitting ones. There are very, very few organizations in the world that can afford to have these models. Microsoft is one, Google is another, the Chinese cluster of companies closely related to the government are another. And there aren't really that many more. I would contrast this with a hypothetical but impossible infinite model. And this was imagined by Borges in the Infinite Library. And of course, that one would be absolutely useless because it would take infinite time or energy to get to any sequence in it. And so it's effectively not, it's useless. Could it exist? Should it exist? And of course it cannot. So there's this, the effect happens at a large scale, but not too large. And you might ask, do we know exactly what that scale is? Not really. We know the beginning of where it starts to work. We know it'll work even better at a larger scale, but there's some point at which it'll start to collapse on itself. We don't know exactly where that peak is. Now, what what can we say about this? What have we learned about language? I think the first thing we can say is that we've learned that most language use is not creative if we look at it from a global perspective, and we've never had a global perspective before. We've never had a way of looking at everything everybody said, but only locally at what somebody published and what somebody said in a conversation and so on. And the internet doesn't give us everything everybody said, but it does give us everything everybody said on the internet, which is a lot, especially for younger generations. And also for anything that's been in a library is also in the model. And the fact that regurgitating, in a sense, or interpolating between what has already been said can simulate somebody saying new things tells us that from a global base, on a global basis, there's a lot of redundancy or a lot of parallel restatement of things, because that's the only basis for this illusion to work, which perhaps shouldn't be a surprise. And yet it's different to actually have evidence of something rather than surmising it. And now we have evidence for the first time of what language as a whole for everyone at once contains, which we didn't have before. Now, what is of interest to me, one of many things of interest to me is that as we start to use these algorithms, not only just as a novelty to say, oh, isn't it cute that it can seem like a math student or a psychologist or whatever we might have it simulating, it is also of interest to me whether, if we start to integrate these types of tools into our own conduct of life, whether we essentially increase the degree of redundancy and lose track of the possibility of creativity. Now, when I say this, I have to say I'm speaking in a way that strongly violates what we can call tech culture, or the usual milieu that I function in, because there's a sort of I would say a dogma or even an orthodoxy that there is not really such a thing as creativity, which sounds a little mystical, but instead there is some sort of a playing out of large scale recombination, and then eventually this turns into something we think of as creativity, very much as Darwinian evolution is very creative, but in any particular instance, it's thought to be sort of random with feedback. And perhaps that's how everything is, and that there is no creativity. Now, I think there's an important difference between the foundational models that we can build today and, say, Darwinian evolution, for just one example. And that difference is that Darwinian evolution is always about something. There can be some difference of opinion that persists to this day about exactly what it is about. There's some sort of hard-nosed adaptationists who'll say it's only about survival, and then there are others, including going back to Darwin, who would say actually there's sort of some sort of aesthetic process involved, sexual selection, and other points of intervention where evolution seems to function a little outside the boundaries of pure survival and have an intrinsic creative quality to it. But at any rate, one can debate those things, but it's very, very hard, and I say this after having debated them for many years, it's very, very hard to come to a definitive conclusion on such a question. However, when we're a program like a foundational program like the GPT generations is not really about a topic external to itself. It's regurgitating original conversations that in most cases were in the original instance about something. So it's a degree removed from being about anything, from being about a topic. And so then the question is there a sense in which if we rely on these things, for instance, if this type of program is used as our tutor, there are many proposals that they become the universal tutors for kids or even adults in education. If it is used as a criminal detective, if it is used as a physician, if it is used as any other task where previously there might have been a human, is there a danger that it limits what then happens to repeats of what has happened before? Now, you'll find many who argue, especially within the tech industry, that we already are seeing creativity, and there are those who think that these things might be conscious inside or something. Once again, very much as with the question of adaptationism and evolution, it's extremely hard to get to an absolute definitive conclusion. However, it is not that hard to design situations to trip up the systems, which is not done that often because people actually want to see them succeed at simulating a human. There's a tremendously strong drive for that, which I'll get to in a second, which I'm deeply suspicious of. So I was thinking about a sort of an irony here, which is the tech culture ethos, or Silicon Valley ethos, if you like, is very much that the future will be not only different from the present or the past, but so different that it's incomprehensible. There's often talk of a singularity, which is when everything changes so much because of our advances in computation that we can't even recognize it, that everything transforms, that the whole universe becomes fluid in a new way because of nanotechnology spreading out to the edges of creation, always, everywhere, or something like that. And this happens all the time. There's a very frequent idea that these artificial intelligence systems will become so effective that they'll solve all of humanity's problems. So you'll often hear, and I mean very often, at like a dinner party, that, well, if you look at how effective GPT is, we can be assured that a program will solve our climate change problem. We can be assured it'll solve any problems related to infectious disease. It'll solve any problems related to the supply of fresh water, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's the only problem we have to work on, and then that will solve everything else. So there's this, let's leave aside for a second whether that hope is well placed or not, or whether it's not. And I think it's not, but let's leave that aside. What I want to note is this sense of the one of the terms is extropia, and there are many other popular terms within tech culture. This notion that the future is taking off and going into places that are unimaginable, that it's radically creative, radically different. Now, so when I talked about irony, what I mean is we've built this thing that would appear to be regurgitative and profoundly nostalgic, profoundly trapped into interpolating things that have already been said. And yet that's in the service of this thing that's supposed to be, you know, profoundly future oriented. And I find that extremely interesting. I was, it's a kind of, you know, the irony, it reminded me a little bit of The Curious Effect of Finnegan's Wake, which I was rereading recently, where you have this, this text that's maximally inventive with as many puns and weird ideas and double entendres and everything per word as is conceivable in English, I suspect, in the service of depicting this being in this cycle in which nothing's really new, right? And so there's this contrast between the nature of the text and what the text is about being almost opposites. And I feel like we have a set of opposites like that in Silicon Valley now, but going in the other direction, where we have a regurgitative, fundamentally uncreative text depicting an infinitely creative future. So it's like the tech culture is the opposite of Finnegan's Wake in a funny way. Now, this concerns me a great deal. The effect is even more apparent, maybe not so much in text, but in visual art, where foundational models of visual stuff. So from the same lab, we have something called DALL-E, and now there's some other versions of it, like Stable Diffusion, some of you might have seen, where you can ask for a piece of art, where you can say, I would like to have rats flying in a flying saucer in the style of Turner, and it'll produce this thing. And you think, wow, this thing's so creative. And yet, it is fundamentally regurgitative. It can input the style of Turner and regurgitate it, but it cannot be a Turner. And also, another interesting thing, I mentioned failure modes. It's easier to see them in the visual. Am I running out of time? Is that why you're in front of me?
You have 5 minutes, so you can choose how to.
Okay, I will use my 5 minutes.
I'm happy to cede some time because it's just an open forum for mine. So please go longer. Don't feel like you need to.
Well, that's very kind of you. It's a dangerous thing to tell me because I'm famous for going on and on and on and on. So you might benefit from constraining me. But at any rate, if you look at the images that are produced by the visual foundational models like DALL-E, they can be very impressive doing such things as what I just made up. And I mean, not that I've tried that particular one, you never know for sure, but probably if you asked for rats in a flying saucer in the style of Turner, it would do it and it would probably look good. I don't know. Somebody can try it now if they have it open. But if you ask it to do hands or any creature with hands, they'll tend to not be good. The fingers will be mangled. And the reason why is that hands have structure. They're not just surface. The hand has to make sense as a functional hand. And interpolating between images of hands tends to mess up that thing. So you tend to have a lot of mangled and weird hands or hands that don't quite work. Now, if you point this out within those who really want to believe in these things as being alive, you'll find the excuses are that people often can't draw hands, which is true. There might very well be some degree of similarity between what goes on in a human brain and what goes on in these programs. I would say that it is beyond our current horizon of science to say how much similarity, but it does seem reasonable to say that there's a little bit or some amount. I don't think it's total, but I don't think it's zero. I think we overstate the similarity when we call the accumulators inside our models neurons. And I think the term artificial intelligence overstates the similarity, and yet there might be something there, I have to say. Um, now, this problem I was bringing up of a regurgitative culture filtered through devices that we can build based on recordings of our past behaviors and communications reminds me a little bit of how many systems that are related to something in the world that might involve a representation of it or a response to it can become overly narcissistic, if you like, or self-oriented. So, for instance, the immune system can generate autoimmune diseases. An economy can become focused on artifacts of itself and become dysfunctional, leading to market failures. Many other examples. And so there's a set, if we can think of these things instead of as people, as a representation system that's vulnerable to
it's 4 p.m.
It is 4 p.m. You can think of this as a system that's vulnerable to becoming trapped in in self-reflection rather than being responsive to the thing that it's supposed to be aligned with. And that would be maybe a less charged way of stating the concern I have about regurgitative culture. But ultimately, I want to get to sort of a mystical level of this. And what I mean by mystical is in a way kind of literal, of mystifying an aspect of what we're doing instead of attempting not to. So I have long held, and I when I say long, I mean one of my mentors when I was quite young was Marvin Minsky, who was probably the most important source of the current ideas about artificial intelligence in terms of the images and cultural references that are in use. And I know I'm out of time. I'll do this really fast. And I used to argue with Marvin when I was young, and Marvin, having been one of the original generation of people who believed in artificial intelligence, loved the argument. But people, as is always the case, the subsequent generations become more orthodox and lose their sense of humor and don't have the kind of charm and openness that the original people had, at least in person. So it's my belief that you cannot have perfect ideas. I don't think there's such a thing as a perfectly completed science or perfectly completed cultural theory or perfectly completed mathematics. Certainly we know that. There's anytime we apply thought or anytime we conceive our world or ourselves, we do so with fractures. That doesn't scare me. I think it's a miracle that we can do anything. The fact that we can even do it partially or imperfectly is fantastic. For some, it bothers them that they can't achieve perfection. I don't know why that should bother them. However, here's what I want to propose in the future, that we must think about where we place our fractures. We do have, through some miracle, which is the beginning of my mystification, through some miracle, we have the ability to choose to a degree where the fractures will be. And what I would propose is that instead of trying to say, well, here we understand what an intelligence is and we can reproduce it in a machine, which then offsets the fracture somewhere else, because then you have the problem of trying to explain, well, where did all this language come in the first place that's been input into the machine? You end up pushing the fracture out backwards, back in time, or to some other spot. I think the better thing is to put the fracture inside the person, very much as there used to be a kind of in European thought, we went through a process of recognizing that you can't prove the existence of God, it's a matter of faith. I think the new thing in response to these models is that we have to start to have a radical mystical belief in the existence of people as the source material from which these models can be built. And we have to treat ourselves as mystical transcendent sources, as sort of supernatural, because any other alternative puts us into a regurgitative trap and makes us subservient to creations that will become self-resident and limit our world, and also concentrate wealth and power unsustainably among the nerds who run the models, by the way. All right, I think that's enough. Thank you so much. I only got to one of the three things I was going to talk about, but there you go.
I have a
Well,
question.
Jaron, if you could stay on longer, it may dovetail quite nicely into what we're going to talk about in the follow-up. So go ahead, Fred.
Yeah, Alan, thank you. We have a few questions here. My first question is, could you please elaborate a little bit more specific? Oh, that's a nice espresso. We're not allowed to.
Yeah, I just made it. I'm a.
Oh, sorry, derailed. Anyway, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you mean by fracture. Thank you.
Okay. So by a fracture, I mean the limits to the ability to make a consistent and complete and perfect assessment of oneself or one's world. In mathematics, we have many such fractures, the most famous maybe being Gödel's theorem, but this is also true everywhere. If you look in the sciences, in physics, you can push back to, I don't know, the Big Bang or something, but there's always some kind of an artifice that you have to make up at the edges of what you can understand, and you can push it back, but not infinitely, and that's formal. I mean, there's never going to be an absolutely complete, fully rounded, circle closed physics. It can get better and better, but not perfect. Similarly, I think our understanding of text can become deeper and deeper, but I think ultimately, as I say, there's always going to be a bit of a mystery about how this thing works at all. We can offset that mystery to something other than text, but we can't offset entirely because we can't make a completely consistent universal view. So I'm proposing that we position the fracture in the person in order to mystify the person and make us sort of special and supernatural rather than machines or any other artifice.
Thank you very much. Fabian.
Thank you. So I'm wondering if one way to put it is that the trap, I mean, is it a genuine trap in the sense that we all lose agency, or that the loss of agency is just temporary, or is it just for some of us, or maybe we actually properly earn agency?
Yeah, well, this was a theoretical question 20 years ago that I used to talk about and write about quite a lot. If anybody's interested in looking at my early concerns about it, there's some essays from the 90s. One is called Half a Manifesto, I think, and the other one's called Agents of Alienation. So that was when it was purely theoretical, but at this point it's not, it's empirical. So the text management programs that we call artificial intelligence are overwhelmingly used for the manipulation of humans now, and not for any discernible productive purpose. And this is, of course, the problem with the social media companies. And what we've seen, the answer is not 100% one thing or another thing. It's a statistical distribution. It's definitely the case that these things have reduced agency among people. For instance, they've reduced rationality and increased mental disease, I would say, in people as a whole. And this has been studied very widely. They've decreased the quality of political discourse very widely, and this has also been studied. And so you see a statistical degradation of what I would call sensible autonomy in people when they are exposed to the algorithms thus far empirically. Now, it's important to understand that there might be a way of, in fact, I think there probably is a way of incorporating these algorithms into life that doesn't have this effect. And it's not the algorithms per se, it's the algorithms combined with an economic incentive because of stupid business models, the so-called, this is the whole thing. Anybody who wants to read this, I've written about it a lot, obviously. So it's also stupid philosophy. So it's bad economics, bad philosophy, combined with the algorithms that make the algorithms destructive of human autonomy, if you like, and dignity. I think the algorithms actually can be useful, and there's no reason for them not to be, but it requires a change in philosophy and economics.
Thank you. There's three more questions. If I can beg answers to be brief, and then we go into the forum.
I'll do my very best.
We're just very grateful you're here. Thank you.
Sure, of course.
Hi, Max Drake here. I really like what you were saying about mysticism, and I think as someone who's worked a lot with GPT-3 so far and seen internet, responses to it, I can definitely imagine a kind of like a dueling. The model itself kind of. Oh, sorry, it cut out.
It cut out.
Yeah, so I can imagine like. Okay, yeah. There's like the possibility of some other kind of mysticism emerging that is more nefarious and places the model itself as kind of the source of that. And I was wondering, is like that what you see as a kind of like, is that similar to, is that what we need to fight against, or is what's your imaginary for?
Right now, people, roughly speaking, there's two ways of interacting with big models online. One of them is where the model is kind of intrinsic to the interaction, and the other one where it's explicit and you know about it. So far with releases like GPT, people know they're interacting with GPT. That's the whole point. And so if the person is let in on the joke, so to speak, if there's an awareness of what's going on, then I think then what you were calling the nefarious nature of it is greatly reduced. And in fact, it's in those circumstances. So one of the problems that a lot of technical culture is formed when people are, especially people with any technical skill or interest, are interacting with these things. And in that case, they're cute and it's not nefarious. But then when the transition happens is when people are using a social media system or anything that has recommendations or anything that constructs an experience feed. And instead of being said, well, here's the model, here's how you can tweak it, here's how you can play with it, it's just intrinsic to their experience. And in that case, it becomes sneaky and very subject, in fact, explicitly subject to corruption, because the whole point is that the third parties are paying in an attempt to control the attention and manipulate the people who are using it. And that's all the Facebook or Meta companies do that. TikTok does it as an example now. And they're all doing that. And that is where the damage comes in. It's when people are having experience created by algorithms that you start to see degradation of human decency and intelligence. And it happens so far universally.
Cool. Thank you.
Hi, I have two very quick related questions. The first one, I would be interested to know what you personally see as the main source of mysticism or potential mysticism inside people. So are you primarily looking at consciousness or some of those things, like you personally? And the second question, oh, sorry, I'm going to pause so you can ask.
Sure. Well, there has been a strong wind of sort of anti-consciousness acknowledgement in technical culture for decades. And I disagree with that tendency. The argument is something like, we used to think the Earth was the center of the universe, and now we should also recognize that our consciousness isn't the center of anything and we're not special and all that. And at first it seems kind of humble and kind of in the line of the Enlightenment, but I think actually all it does is forces the mysticism somewhere else. And for instance, people who talk about AI algorithms and believe in it, that they're conscious or something, will never stop sprinkling magic dust on the algorithms. Oh, it's so magical, it's come alive. But then they'll say for people, oh no, these people are just, it's a kind of an inconsistent thing. Like what you're doing is you're moving the magic dust from people to the machine, but the machine is owned by some company, and it's politically and economically a terrible idea, but it's also just philosophically sloppy. And I just think we should admit that we can't get rid of magic dust, and we might as well put it on the person. There are many angles on this, and I've been in the consciousness arguments for many years. But I, I would say consciousness is the one thing that cannot be reduced if it's an illusion. And we should treat it as a uniquely efficient place to put our seams. You know, it's like the most sensible place. And so consciousness is some kind of empirical, it's some kind of a channel that's not empirical, it's something else. I don't think you can prove it. I used to sometimes argue with people who were skeptical of it, like Dan Dennett, that the only way you can, there are some people who are professional philosophers who claim not to be conscious, and maybe you can believe them, but in general, one should have the faith that other people are conscious, and maybe that's the more appropriate and useful contemporary faith instead of faith in God. It's similar actually, but it's slightly different. It just, and then the other question I would ask is, if we're going to create a society that's run by algorithms, if we don't elevate people in some mystical or supernatural way, how can it serve people? If it's all just information components, why doesn't it just devolve to whoever owns the computer and serving them? I don't see any other way unless you make people special. And you see that in the early Enlightenment documents about democracy and society. You see this recognition that you have to just treat people as special, and there's no ultimate logical justification. There's a pragmatic reason, given a set of opposing beliefs that can't be resolved through logical competition, that you have to become pragmatic. And weirdly, we have come to a point where mysticism is the most pragmatic choice, as well as I believe the most philosophically gracious one.
So many quotes from that about putting people in a mystical position. I think that's absolutely beautiful. We have one last question for you from Bent, and then Alan will go into the forum. Apologies everyone for running over, but no
yeah,
apology.
my apologies. I'm terribly undisciplined.
No apology, because it's you. We're very, very grateful.
Okay.
Yes.
Hi, Jaron. It's so
Hello.
good to see you. Thank you so much.
Hey.
It's been a while. So it's been, I'm sorry you couldn't be here in person. Actually, this isn't the question, it's an observation. As usual, listening to you is an intellectual romp. And several new phrases have occurred to me as I listened. The first one is stochastic retrieval, which is basically what a lot of these GPT things do. Second, casual retrieval, which is what happens when you have the dialogue. And I really like your idea of the universal tutor. These things know more than we do, although they also know, false things as well as true things. And that's a problem we have to deal with. And the last point is that since this is really recreating already existing dialogue, so to speak, human discourse, this could be used to create a dialogue with a dead person. And that suggests that another label for these is rhetorical zombie.
Mhm. May I respond?
Yeah. Well, what would you do if I said no? But go ahead.
I have no control of the video feed on your end, so you guys can cut me off at any time. Let us be clear about the power relationship here. And so nice to see you. This tendency to want to revive the dead using algorithms is very, very widespread in tech culture. And I think we should treat it as an evil. I understand there could be some circumstances where it could have utility, and there are often scenarios discussed where, oh, I don't know, some kid has a traumatic loss of a parent. I did when I was young, by the way. I lost my mother when I was young. And then this notion that maybe it could be therapeutic. I think we should adopt. It's kind of interesting looking at the Islamic resistance to representing people as images that has been traditional. Perhaps I'm not proposing that we adopt that, and yet I think looking at the impulse and its source is instructive and worthwhile. I think there's a terrible danger in telling a kid that the parent can be represented in code. I think demystifying the parent, turning the parent into something that's a portion of a database or an algorithm, demystifying the parent will inevitably instead mystify the computer or whoever provides the service or something. There's no way to remove mystification because there's no way to have a complete point of view. So the inevitable conclusion of simulating a dead person is to subsume that person into somebody else's scheme, just given how politics and economics work. And so I think we should treat it as an evil, and I would like to see it become treated as a moral outrage, possibly even illegal in some circumstances. I really do feel that this is a road to civilizational ruin. Few agree with me, but I think more will come to see the merit in this concern.
I agree with you. Okay, I thank you from the bottom of my heart, and everybody here thanks you again. Please feel free to join the discussion over the next almost hour. Alan will introduce the session, and thank you very much again.
I will see if I can stay. I have to go to something in a little bit, but I'll do my best to stay for a while. Thank you so much for your attention and for inviting me. I do really appreciate it.
Thank you.